Good afternoon, and in this session on environments and landscapes of Latin America's past, Professor Vernon Scarborough of the University of Cincinnati and Professor Eduardo Neves of the University of Sao Paulo will discuss the role that archaeology is playing in assessing the human ecological future of the past and of the future of the planet.
Hello there. My name is Vernon Scarborough. I'm an archaeologist from the University of Cincinnati, and I've worked in the my area specifically for at least 30 years, but more globally elsewhere. And today I would like to introduce some thoughts with regard to the title, as you see here, Ecologies of the New World and the Old in 1491. And are there some lessons to be learned, and how we might address archaeology as an important subject in treating questions associated with the Earth archives. Two, I'd like to thank the organizers, and maybe particularly Chris Fisher, for this invitation. At the outset, I just want to introduce two figures that you're all very familiar with that were responsible, of course, as founders for notions of ecology. And those relationships environmentally, beginning with Humboldt, as well as Darwin on his heels, that really did redefine notions of environment and the interplay between plants, animals, and humans to a degree. What is interesting about these two individuals, that it was no accident that they were informed and we're able to elucidate these complicated concepts about the environment by visits to the New World, particularly the tropics. And I want to look at that with a little more care and what the implications of that might be. What is also interesting, that neither of these individuals in that 1800 period were aware of the density of people in the New World that were interfacing with their environments. And I think that's an important lesson that we want to examine. Their background, of course, was coming out of the Industrial Revolution, or that great acceleration period. In the 1700s and the 1800s, so much was changing. Technologies were flourishing, particularly in Western Europe. And those technologies are what we live with today. And those technological breakthroughs are very much a Western concept that has interfaced with our lifestyles today. The downside, of course, at that time, and to a degree even today, were the problems with labor well-being. And every individual at that time that was knowledgeable about these changes socially were concerned. This is the Dickens concern, of course. Many authors at that time were speaking to it. Pollution and disease were rampant. Industrialization brought people together. And these were some of the downsides of this new world we're in today. A European model might be seen as one that was deeply rooted in this notion of a exploitation of the environment, as opposed to its harvesting and in renewal. Ecosystem services were really considered free, no cost. And as a consequence, the quote from the Genesis here is most appropriate, I think. The Old World in 1491 was heavily affected by some of this deforestation concern that I've mentioned. Not that it didn't occur in the New World, but it was much less influential. It was a different way of treating the environment. And again, I think that's something we might want to reflect on. And notions of ecology more generally. Deforestation in this right panel is indicated that early on, Europe was quite forested, as you might well expect it, but as populations began to spike, and particularly with the emphasis on technologies to harvest, really to exploit the environment, deforestation became more and more of a concern. And this is something I think that was much less apparent in the New World. And one of the reasons that ecology, through the eyes of a Humboldt or a Darwin, was able to be elucidated in a very different manner. I mean, when we talk about the New World, there were these great centers that existed. And when the Spanish did move into Mexico City today, at the great site of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, what they saw was what they referred to, one of the chroniclers, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, he felt that he was seeing or living a dream. It was an unreal environment in many ways. And the city itself was an internally draining lake basin that was highly saline, much like our Great Lakes today in present-day Utah here in the States. And very difficult place to grow things, let alone drink potable water. But the Nahuatl speakers, the Aztecs themselves, had modified that environment to basically introduce spring waters, fresh waters, and cordon off a portion of the lake to produce an environment that was highly productive with potable supplies. Again, very, very clever way of working with things. Now, in this world, there were no wheels. The functional metals were absent. Domesticated beasts of burden were also not apparent, except for the llama in Peru, of course. But basically, it was turkeys and guinea pigs, what people would domesticated. And as a consequence, the way they modified the environment was through labor. Technology and technology breakthroughs were not emphasized at all in the same way. There were no, again, the elements I just mentioned were absent, and what they worked with was clay, stone, and wood. Yet they built cities as attractive as this one, Tenochtitlan. Huge populations, we know that. And the populations were large in part because there were no domesticated animals. Zoonotic diseases were not rampant like they were in the old world. And the adaptation, both genetically and socially, to things like smallpox, which were devastating in periods of time in the old world, were absolutely horrible when they were introduced to the New World. There was no resistance. So without those domesticated animals, they were very, very vulnerable. Two, because of the lack of these technological breakthroughs in the old world, many times precipitated by policies that involve violence and warfare, and produced these new techniques in order to conquer a neighbor. Because those were absent, or at least less developed, the number of people that would have been eliminated because of warfare was also considerably less. So populations were large, and the emphasis then was on people in every sense. Forests were a big part of their equation, and even today in indigenous populations, there's a different relationship with the environment and forests. And what we end up finding in these settings are a notion, as captured by an ethnohistorian, Lopez Austin, a saying made by Nahuatl speakers, those Aztec speakers, that went something like this: when trees were harvested, basically one begs, quote, one begs for forgiveness before felling a tree, and at that time a prayer is made to honor its felling. So again, it's a just different notion of how to live within your environmental setting. Another element in all of this, of course, or in complementary to this, is the world was highly animated, and in terms of how they interacted with that plant and animal community that surrounded them. And these are just some quick examples. You know, the Maya used their glyph communication, that is their writing systems, by using some of these animal forms and plants too, molding clay, painting it, also carving in wood, or the same tool of sculpting in stone. They would produce these images that emphasized the natural world. We do have profiles, that is, portraits of kings and queens, but mostly in places like the Maya area. And elsewhere, it's much more this kind of communication, this kind of symbolism. So animism does appear to be a really big part of how they interacted with their environments. Beyond forests, or in addition to forests, because hills were clearly modified, there were systems of terraces that were both in tropics and in more semi-arid settings throughout the New World. And of course, terracing was something that was done in the Old World as well. But there may have been a different relationship with the land than we find in the New World. And these surfaces were used to both place houses. They were domestic terraces, and it gave you more horizontal land to live on, but also, of course, agricultural productivity associated with these settings. And they were controlled, or it controlled erosional rates, as you might well expect, and aggradation concerns with regard to sedimentation, and all the unintended consequences of modifying these settings were somehow built into the equation when they modified an environment. One thing that would crosscut a lot of this were roads, ways of communicating goods and services and ideas, over a landscape. And this is just an example from a chronicler looking at Cusco, the capital of the Inca, and how they might have seen the world, how they did see the world with regard to moving through it by way of roadways. These were all terrestrial. And so the environment, again, was something that was sacred, but could be functional and economic and ideological at the same time. Another element, another environment that was a very big deal in the New World were wetlands, these swamps, many times seasonal, sometimes not, but they were harvested again in a manner very different than we find in the Old World. For the most part, forests were cut down to make way for crofts and tofts and ways of harvesting or exploiting the environment in the Old World. And wetlands were drained as quickly as possible because they were really the source, much the way the environments, the forest environments in the old world, they'd harbor malevolent spirits and forces. They were fetid to places you didn't want to go. In the New World, they were considered a great asset. And there are occasions where there are savannas abutting natural wetlands that were deliberately flooded, opened up to accommodate food and the movement of people. Because again, no wheel, and a wheel wouldn't be very appropriate in many of these settings. They would use their canoe systems to pass through it. These are chinapas, floating gardens, as the Spanish said. They're not actually floating, of course, but they are surfaces that could be planted. And the wealth of resources, corn, beans, and squash, and a myriad of other plants that we are semi-domesticated, were being harvested in these settings in a manner, again, very different. And these very rich wetlands were particularly important. You can actually, even today, take a canoe for 30, 40 kilometers through these water systems, these canal systems that connect to distributaries and river systems without lifting the bow of your boat. You can move along. Again, wheel wouldn't be particularly advantageous, nor would domesticated animals. So the impetus for some of these, quote, technological breakthroughs we find in the Old World were not a clear factor in the New. And they were able to live within, if you will, their means, the natural world, for lengthy periods. Again, something that is best conveyed by the work of thinkers like Darwin and Humboldt before him. They are also useful, these wetlands, for controlling storm surges because they absorb that force and then could be released or would release naturally very slowly. And again, that would accommodate erosion, concerns with regard to the availability of water year round. In closing, the Maya is the area I'm most familiar with. And I'm going to look at a kind of a composite of all the different environments we've talked about very, very briefly. But early on in the Maya prehistory, or history, because they didn't have a recording system, they appear to have moved into these swamp-like settings, these great, they call them bajos, depressions in the Maya area, which make up about 40% of the landscape today. And in that zone, by the time of Christ, maybe a period of time during the late pre-classic, this is a period from maybe 400 BCE to maybe 100 years current epic here at the present. That period of time, that 400 or 500 year period, they would occupy the margins of these great swamps and build their communities. And they would drain them and they would build reservoirs to hold water for longer periods of time and accommodate erosion concerns. And they did very, very well. Now, this is an environment where it is semi-tropical in the sense that it rains for about, probably 7 months or so. But the rest of the year, it's drought-like. And so holding water in these reservoirs is particularly productive. It's karstic, so the surface rainfall, rivers and such, are really few and far between. So holding water in reservoirs was a very smart thing. With time, however, during that late preclassic period, there was major disruptions, partly because they were so successful and they harvested, exploited at some point, probably at the end of the line, their environment. And then there was a drought. We have that clearly indicated. So those things too came together and forced another kind of adaptation. The Maya could have been a done deal. That is, they could have fragmented and collapsed. They didn't. They're very clever, and they actually moved up to the margins of the hillocks that flank the swamps. And the lower register is just that. Now they were building at the summit of these ridges and hillocks, and they could hold water elevated in these tanks, and that water then could be released slowly during the dry season to accommodate a population that might ring, like concentric rings around the summit of these hillocks. Probably the best example, archetypical, comes from Tikal in present-day Guatemala, the Petén area department. It was this convex setting, and here you can see a water mountain at work. And that water mountain term is something you find both in indigenous populations today, from Chile to Arizona, the notion that mountains themselves held water, that they were somehow repositories, almost hollow-like, that would accommodate water via springs. The Maya, on the other hand, actually created a water mountain by holding water, as I've just mentioned. Okay, in closing, we have some notions here with regard to lessons learned. And you've all seen the hockey stick curve about where we're headed in terms of climate change and resources. And are there some elements from the kind of presentation I'm giving you, and as well as Eduardo Neves that follows with respect to how to deal with our future, drawing from a very complex and less well understood past from the archaeological record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vern. It was an amazing presentation as usual. I would like to start by saying that I'm glad to be here. I would like to thank the invitation and the initiative by Chris Fisher and Steve Lies, and also the hard work done by people of Connect Me in putting this together. I just want to have some, yeah, can you see me? Everything is fine. I have a few slides here just to show And and because Vern did such a nice job, my presentation dash comments will build on his. Thank you very much, Vern.
Thank you.
I just have a few slides about the Amazon, and I'd like to share with you, and then to tell a story why we need to do LiDAR in the Amazon and why it can be very important for the future of the Amazon, not only for archaeology, but actually for the future of the Amazon. So let me so if you look at this map, this is a map, a general image of the Amazon, just like a few facts about the Amazon. If you look at the greater Amazon, not only the Amazon basin, but the Orinoco, parts of the upper Orinoco River in southern Venezuela, it's almost the size of the continental US. So it's a very large area of the world. Just for you to have an idea, about 20% of all fresh water, above ground fresh water that we have in the world, drains from the mouth of the Amazon. So that just gives you an idea, a dimension of the scale and the size of these large parts of South America. If you look at, one thing, I mean, there are lots of remarkable things about the Amazon. I don't have the time to talk about all of them, but one thing that amazes me, it's the amount of native language that we find in the Amazon, in the greater Amazon area. Around 300 languages are spoken today. A lot of them are vanishing in the Amazon today, and these languages are grouped into like 50 genealogical units or families. The point here, like the take-home message, is just like there's a lot of cultural diversity in the Amazon today. But also what archaeology has been telling us is that the Amazon was a major center of cultural innovation in the New World. We have this old picture that see tropical places, and Vern just mentioned that in his presentation, as backwards, marginal places in the deep history of the Americas. But if you look, for instance, at the evidence of plant domestication, we know today that the Amazon was an independent center of plant domestication in the world. Some of the important crops that we consume today, things like peanuts, manioc, many fruit trees, were domesticated or cultivated first in the Amazon. Also, this is a site that I'm excavating now in southwestern Amazon. We know that the Amazon, it's an artificial shell mound. Everything that you see here, this whole island, is an artificial island that began to be built around 6,000 years ago. If you look at the profile here, this for the archaeologists who are watching. This, this stratum here in yellow, orangey, yellowish, everything that you saw here was brought by people who were building this place starting 6,000 years ago. But what we also find in this place called Monte Castelo is evidence of early ceramic production. We have pottery there going back to 6,000 years ago. And there's evidence from across the Amazon that shows us that the Amazon was also, besides being a center of plant domestication, was an early center of ceramic production. The earliest pottery of the Americas was made in the Amazon in different places. Not only this one that I'm showing, it started 7,000 years ago. What we're finding doing archaeology, and Vern also mentioned roads. For instance, this is not LiDAR map. This is just drone map that I've did in an area where I'm working southwestern Amazon. If you look at the right side here, you're going to see these are archaeological sites like ring villages with mounds around central plazas, and you can see those straight lines here. Those are roads coming out of these villages. We're just beginning to map a network of roads connecting villages in this part of southwestern Amazon. This is just one brief example to show you that there's the amount of, the large amount of archaeological sites and features that may be hidden behind under the canopy of the forest until today. So if I have, if I have to sum up very briefly, we can say that if you look at, the archaeology of the Amazon, we have a deep history that started around 12,000 years ago. Archaeology shows us that the Amazon is not a pristine forest. It's been transformed by indigenous people over the millennia. So we have an entanglement between natural and cultural patrimonies. Actually, that we can say in the Amazon that the natural patrimony is cultural patrimony. It's very hard to separate the dimension of nature, if you look at the Amazonian landscapes today, from the dimension of culture. And also that forces of knowledge, because they have there a record of human innovation and technological knowledge, which is evolved over the millennia. And what's happening today in the Amazon? We lost in the last 40 years, 20% of the Amazon. If you look at this map here, everything that you see in orange is areas which have been lost by deforestation. I mean, these are natural savannas here, But everything that you see here, and these are natural savannas as well, but everything else that you see here in this part of the Amazon, if you can see my laser pointing here, this has been lost. We lost 20% of the Amazon, and that loss has not generated any wealth for Brazil and for the world. It's really a tragedy. So I think we can say that today in the Amazon, we have a major contrast. If you look back at the archaeology, 12,000 years of human occupation, transforming landscapes and increasing agro-biodiversity. And in the last 40 years, we lost 20% of it for nothing. And that's even more so dramatic. If you look at the white dots here in this map, these are places where non-contacted or isolated indigenous groups live in the Amazon. That's the place in the world where we have the largest amount of non-contacted indigenous societies, more than 60 groups. And these people are struggling against the wave of deforestation, which is a very violent process. This is a picture which was released a few years ago, the Mashco Piru Indians, that's not far away from where I work, at the border of Peru and Brazil. And that's what happened to some of these areas. For instance, this square structure that you see here is what we call a geoglyph site. It's a geometric site created by ditches, which are dug into the ground, and soybean farming. We see deforestation here, forests being cut, and soybean farming is getting all the way to those very places. And these sites, again, they have a record of human occupation, but also a record of the knowledge of the people who transformed the forest over the millennia. This is in the southern fringe of the Amazon. Soybean farming, cattle farming, it's spreading very fast, and even more so today with Bolsonaro's government in Brazil. Illegal logging all over the place that we see along this deforestation arc in the Amazon. Violent process, this happened, at the end of last year. Here, Franciscato, he was someone who worked for many years with isolated groups for the Brazilian government. He was killed by an arrow shot when he was trying to establish, to avoid conflict between isolated groups and farmers in this area of southwestern Amazon. Illegal mining, you've probably been following that in the Yanomami lands today, and in Brazil and Venezuela, it's out of control. So we're losing the Amazon in a very fast pace, and that's a tragedy for Brazil and for the world. What we think we have to do is to use LiDAR. If you look at these areas here, number from 1 to 10, these are places, most of them are placed along the deforestation arc. And these are areas where we want to do LiDAR survey to find archaeological sites. We want to have archaeology and the knowledge about archaeological sites in these areas to build another layer of protection against the devastation of the Amazon. We want to use archaeology as a tool to create a firewall to prevent further destruction of the Amazon. And we have to do it now because time is changing very fast. And if we don't act now, we're going to lose even more of this precious forest and the people, traditional people, forest people who live there as well. Thank you very much. It was very brief, just a wrap up from Vern's presentation. Thank you.